Welcome to today's panel webinar about the 5 steps to better threat monitoring, detection, and response. My name is Holger Schulze, and I'll be your moderator today. I'm the founder and CEO of Cybersecurity Insiders, an online community of over 370,000 IT security professionals that started a few years ago with the information security community on LinkedIn. Earlier this month, we released the 2017 Threat Monitoring, Detection, and Response Report, based on the results of a comprehensive online survey of cybersecurity professionals to gain more insights, into the latest security threats faced by organizations and the solutions to detect, remediate, and prevent these threats. Today, our panel of cybersecurity experts will discuss the key findings of this report as well as best practices to improve threat management. Now, next, I would like to welcome our panel of cybersecurity experts. First, we have Orion Cassetto with Exabeam. Hello, Orion.
Hey, everyone. Happy to be here.
Thanks for being on the panel today. Next, we have Pramod Cherukemilli with Deterrence Systems. Hello, Pramod.
Hi, everyone. This is Pramod. Glad to be here.
Thank you, Pramod. Next, we have Mayank Chowdhury with Observit. Hello, Mayank.
Hey, Holger, and hello to everyone else as well.
Thank you, Mayank. Next, we have Salim Hafid with BitGlass. Hello, Salim.
Hi, Holger. Hello, everyone.
And last but not least, we have Travis Rosick with BlueVector. Hello, Travis.
Hey, good afternoon, Holger. Glad to be here, everybody.
Excellent. Let's get started. For each of our surveys, we like to gain a perspective on, organizations' overall confidence in their security posture. And when comparing survey results from, this threat monitoring report to a prior survey that we conducted in January of 2017, we found that responses for people who are moderately to extremely confident, that those responses declined by a collective 5 percentage points. And that's significant. And we think this may be due to concerns following the recent spate of ransomware attacks. And a third of organizations believes that the likelihood of a successful attack is actually increasing over the next 12 months. So things are not really improving for cybersecurity teams. Next, we asked our survey participants about the most critical threat management priorities they're pursuing to increase their security posture and confidence over the next 12 months. Not surprisingly, improved threat detection was the most significant priority at 67%, by a large margin above things like improved investigation and analysis of threats at 44%, and proactive threat hunting at 43%. Now, next we asked our respondents to identify the areas of cyber threats that are most concerning to them. And not surprisingly, given the recent spate of ransomware attacks that I mentioned earlier, these attacks and the resulting impact of on data loss were the highest ranking concerns at 48% and 47% respectively. Security teams' concerns are evolving, with the rapidly changing nature of cyber threats. And in comparing the results of this study to our cybersecurity trends report that we created earlier this year, we saw a significant growth in the level of concern with phishing, malware, and ransomware attacks. And we also noted a similar growing concern with insider threats, even though insider threat has a slightly different underlying root cause, and we can talk about that in a minute. But first, let me ask our panel, and this question is specifically for Pramod at Deterrence Systems. Pramod, where should security teams start when it comes to mitigating such a large variety of threats? Pramod?
Yeah, it's a great question, Holger. I'd say first, as the survey indicated, 67% indicated they need to improve the threat detection. So first start with detection, and in order to do that, a lot of security teams need the right security architecture in place. This architecture could be series of tools. It could be a SIM, a DLP, or a data lake with maybe the new UBA tools in place. Once the detection systems are in place and there is visibility around what is happening, then start the people and the device-centric approach. People-centric approach is where a lot of times what we find is, a lot of negligent users who don't know the policies and who don't know how to, behave in terms of, what to download, what to upload. So there's a lot of training. So before we even get into the rest of the processes of, mitigating and so on, I think training employees is a critical component. And then making sure that, all the devices that are out there are patched, because we saw with the latest ransomware that happened because of an unpatched Microsoft server. So, it's extremely important to know what is the latest patches on all the systems, and again, get that visibility into what devices you have, and same thing with access controls and so on. Who has what access, and have they been updated correctly? So that part of detection and visibility is probably the first step I would start with.
Thank you, Pramod. That's good advice. Next, let me ask Salim at BitClass. Salim, what is driving the proliferation of ransomware and the growing frequency of phishing attacks? Salim?
Yeah, it's interesting, Holger. I think these modern ransomware and phishing attacks have really evolved and are becoming incredibly sophisticated, right? In the case of some of these phishing attacks, right, we saw maybe 3-6 months ago the widely publicized G Suite Google Docs phishing attack, where some hackers took advantage of of OAuth and a vulnerability there that really led people to trust a malicious application, right, and gave a malicious application access. So it's not your traditional phishing attacks, and it's really much more sophisticated than that now, right? People are spoofing legitimate credentials or taking advantage of loopholes in existing systems to get you to really trust an email or a notification of some sort and give someone malicious access. So there's no question there why the concerns are growing. And on the ransomware side, you have a similar issue, right? You have, of course, widely publicized again. You have Petya, WannaCry, some of these, attacks that are targeted and can be incredibly devastating for organizations, right? Many organizations affected by some of these ransomware attacks. And the fact of the matter is, ransomware attacks, especially unknown attacks, are hard to detect, hard to prevent. And organizations, oftentimes today don't have the tools to prevent those sorts of attacks, right? Even if you have some sort of endpoint protection solution deployed that can detect zero-day malware, if that data spreads to an unmanaged device that belongs to an employee, an unmanaged device that has access to corporate data in some way, that's another threat vector that folks need to be aware of and need to take steps to prevent.
Thank you, Salim. Very good. Next, we asked our survey participants about their, biggest challenges and barriers, right, to success. And it's starting with the detection of advanced threats at 62%, followed by detection and mitigation of insider attacks. Interestingly, insider attacks ranking that high, and staffing and resource challenges and lack of visibility into IT assets and the various vulnerabilities across the IT environment. Now, these challenges regarding detection, visibility, resources, they are very consistent, right, across the cybersecurity industry and also across all of our research that we have been conducting over the years. This leads me to my next panel question, and Travis, let me ask you, Travis at BlueVector, how can organizations break down, if you will, these barriers to success? Travis?
Great question. These it's quite a loaded question. These barriers are very complicated, and you could probably have a slide each on the details and intricacies of each topic, and they vary widely across organizations as well. With respect to the threats, capabilities, the staffing and resources, and internal policies of companies. So it's a laundry list of capabilities. I would say, based on some of the metrics in the reports here, looking at advanced threats. So as advanced threats, from an adversary perspective, it's a cat and mouse game, right? So they are adapting and trying to gain persistence into your environment. So I think what we see in the top two barriers here with respect to advanced threats, as well as the insider threat component, where the adversary actually steals credentials to the environment, and then once the initial breach is over, they persist and they look just like a normal employee of the company. So at that point, it's very similar to an insider threat component. So there's two approaches to the problem here. One is, from a best practices perspective, is focusing on pre-breach detection. Obviously, with unknown threats, relying on signature-based technologies isn't going to be helpful. In the industry, there's been some movement around machine learning, applying supervised machine learning to the pre-breach problem. So that would be one best practice, is relying on capabilities that give you some type of dynamic defense capability around threats. And then on the post-breach side of it, where you're looking at the insiders, and once the adversary maintains some level of persistence, you're looking at that post-breach approach. Now, that covers the top two areas, but to cover the other items of the report, looking at the advanced staff, the shortage there, looking at automation and some of the lack of capabilities around reporting tools and the confidence. It comes down really to capabilities that are very intuitive. So they provide rich context to an analyst or an incident responder as they're trying to do triage and resolve these potential incidents. So, tools that give you that context and automate a lot of that legwork. And the intuitive piece of it, to where a 15-year veteran or a PhD level analyst is required to actually make sense of the tools. So, using that context to help with some of the automation and prioritization, which also would lead to making it more intuitive and making more of your workforce capable with the tools. So I think those are all, some different areas of best practice to address those multitude of barriers to success.
Excellent. Thank you, Travis. The next question is for you, Orion, at Exabeam. And the question is, what can security teams do to address some of these barriers? Orion?
Thanks, Holger. If I look at these barriers, what I'd like to do is to take a step back and look at the trends in them. If you look at them, there's 7 items on the slide, of which 4 of them really boil down to detection, if you ask me. So you've got detecting advanced threats, detecting insider threats. You've got, number, 5, which is confidence, confidence in being able to find, lack of confidence in automated tools catching all the threats. So there, again, you're really looking at, how confident are you in your ability to detect things? And then finally, the last one, monitoring security infrastructure. So to me, these all boil down to detection. The other ones, lack of security staff, that comes down to a staffing issue. And then you've got visibility over assets and vulnerabilities, and then finally reporting. So at a trend level, we've got detection and visibility, we've got staffing and reporting. And I think, to break down these barriers, security teams should really be looking for solutions that implement modern technologies. So things like machine learning, data science, behavioral modeling, and can improve the existing people, processes, and technologies that they've already got in place. For example, from a visibility and detection point of view, getting all of the logs that you have from all of your existing, point products, getting all that data into one place, then holistically analyzing it with the technologies that I just mentioned, data science, behavioral modeling, machine learning, can allow you to better detect and have, enterprise-wide visibility. You basically can take all these point products and all the data from them and analyze it together such that you see a much bigger picture. For staffing, I think it really comes down to looking for tools that can help with automation. So things like orchestration, using APIs and playbooks to automate so that you can get more out of your existing staff.
Excellent. Thank you, Ryan. We just briefly touched on the aspect of detecting insider threats, right? And interestingly, the majority of respondents actually find it more difficult to detect and prevent an insider attack versus an external, cyber attack. Mayank at Observer, let me ask you, detection seems to be a key theme among survey respondents, with, 48% saying that detection of insider threats is a top challenge for their security teams, and 61% saying it's more difficult to detect and prevent internal attacks compared to external ones. Could you share any thoughts as to why detection of insider threats is such an issue, and perhaps any recommendation on how to avoid common pitfalls?
Great question, Holger, and I think Orion from Exabeam had a good segue towards looking at threats from a kind of two perspectives. Traditionally, we have seen external threats as being the key vector or the key threat that customers are concerned about. Obviously, a lot of technologies that are out there in the market have done a good job of detecting external threats, but more and more we see a shift in the industry, as you and the survey pointed out, that insider threats is becoming more and more real. More and more companies now suffer from insider threats, which essentially includes insiders that could be your employees or your contractors or your third-party vendors, etc. One of the key reasons why it is difficult to detect insider threats, because these are your trusted users, these are your badged employees or contractors or partners that you give access to do what you need to do to run your business. So they are trusted to begin with access to critical data that is sensitive or confidential or private to the company. And as a result, it's much harder to detect these particular users as compared to an external threat where you can actually trace it down to an individual process or a ransomware attack. So that's number one. Second thing you talked about, Holger, which is any recommendations, from the research we have done and seen in the market. We see, and we advise customers as well, to look at this from a holistic perspective, an insider threat program that brings obviously people, process, and technology together. And people aspect of it, which is the user aspect of it, very important as you start to look at developing insider threat programs to tackle, either to detect them or eliminate insider threats. So critical to look at it from a holistic perspective rather than just a technology problem as you start to see and tackle insider threats, which is a big problem that is shaping up.
Very interesting. Thank you, Mayank. Among our survey respondents, the primary pattern, if you will, of threat management appears to be one of blocking, right, if you will, with deterrence methods here in the survey at 67%, denial at 66%, so both sort of blocking types of patterns. Post-event activities such as detection, here at 56%, and incident response at 54%, were not quite as common. Even though the numbers are high, they definitely take, for most organizations, a backseat to the deterrence methods that we see. Now, this reflects what we have seen as the most common security posture, right? Defend first, but be prepared to respond to anything that gets through. Pramod, let me ask you, Pramod at Detect Systems, is there a missing piece in these focus areas, in your opinion, Pramod?
Yeah, so obviously, like you mentioned, we've covered both the prevention side of it there, which is where a lot of folks want to focus on. Now, on the detection side, when a device is on the network, in the corporate network, then there are ways to mitigate, either through firewall rules or whatever as has been mentioned there, or use some sort of a monitoring tool. But then when the device, especially with either the bring your own device or taking laptops to outside the corporate network, then it becomes extremely hard for people to, for the security team to understand what's happening. In many cases, what we see is, they have vendors or they have contractors. And so even in the detection side of it, I think it's important to also make sure that when the device is off the corporate network, what's happening there, and make sure that there is visibility and there's detection component around, understanding what the user is doing and if that's normal or not, either using some sort of an anomaly detection tool or actually first gathering the data. A lot of times the data is completely missing from the data set that's available today. I was surprised that in the post-breach side of it, there is obviously with insider threats, some of it is malicious intent, some of it is negligent. So there's always going to be training portion to it, or policy, enforcement or improvement portion to it, and that is a piece probably some companies need to absolutely focus on. Folks are so focused on preventing and not focused on teaching or not focused on training employees and making sure that they understand the repercussions of what they do. And the final thing which I mentioned earlier is also the same thing as making sure that all the devices have been patched up. Because at the end of the day, people and asset is what's causing a lot of these problems. So if there are already solutions available, and if people haven't patched it up or they haven't trained the employees well enough, then you are going to see things that could have been easily prevented. So those are some of the areas that probably need more focus.
That's great advice. Thank you, Pramod. Next, let me ask Salim at BitGlass. Salim, why have organizations opted for deterrence over other means of threat management? Or does detection still have a place in a cloud-first world? Salim?
Detection absolutely still has a place in sort of this cloud mobile-first world. You need to know what's going on in the organization. You need to know, be able to identify those threats and those risky behaviors first. That said, I think a big part of the reason why deterrence has really taken the lead here, right? 67% as opposed to 56% of folks focusing on deterrence versus detection is really because deterrence works, right? Where you have some of these access control policies in place, where you encrypt the data, you're taking an extra step as an organization to prevent a lot of the risky behavior that if those tools weren't in place, folks would be much more inclined to engage in some of these risky behaviors, right? So deterrence, a great solution for organizations that are aware that there is a problem, and in every organization there is a problem. Let's make no mistake. You're going to have whether it's insiders or malicious folks on the outside trying to get at corporate data. There's always some issue, and it may not be malicious. It may just be carelessness. It may just be negligence. As we explored in the survey and in the research, but deterrence really proving effective for a lot of organizations, right? Especially when you have a sensitive subset of data. If you're a healthcare organization and you have protected health information, you're a financial services organization, you have some payment card information or what have you. Having those policies in place that apply to those specific subsets of data that are heavily regulated and can be incredibly expensive for the organization to deal with a breach involving, right? If it's some of this PHI getting a slap on the wrist by the Department of Health and Human Services can be incredibly costly for a healthcare organization. Not just in terms of fines, but also in terms of reputation. So deterrence, specifically for the most sensitive data in an organization, then more broadly that can apply to individual users, individual groups, individual device types, some that you may see as more risky in your organization than others. Those sorts of access controls and technology-driven policies, as opposed to just training your employees, very effective.
Very good. Thank you, Salim. Let's take a quick look at this from an insider threat perspective. And let me ask Mayank at Observe It, Mayank, when you think about insider threats, should our primary focus be on deterrence and defense rather than detection and response? Mayank?
Yeah, Holger, great question. And, the answer is, it's a mix of the two, and it varies. And the reason I say so, it varies depending upon the type of user or the insider you're looking at. Either it's a third-party vendor versus your employees that you're concerned about from an insider risk perspective. It could vary based on the culture of the organization that you have built inside the company as well. So what we have seen is that it's important for vendors like us and others, colleagues on the call today, and in the market, to provide the flexibility to customers to dial up or down based on what they see inside the company. And what we've seen work is, starting first with gaining visibility into what users do with the data in terms of where do they, what content do they access, what applications do they browse, what URLs or browsers do they look at. Just looking at the context of what the users do with the data, and then providing detection capabilities that help you see the early warning signs before the trouble happens, and also prevent it with a view of a kind of suite of options that may include deterrence, that may include education, that may include some severe actions like blocking if needed to interrupt the workflow of the user. And at the end of the day, also streamline the investigation process if an incident does happen to begin with. So to kind of summarize, Holger, it's a mix, depends upon the maturity of the organization, the culture, as well as, more importantly, the type of user you are concerned about from an insider risk perspective. And the vendors need to provide technology solutions for customers to start at any given point of time based on what they see and could work inside their company.
Excellent. Thank you, Mayank. Okay, so we looked at some of the key patterns, right, for threat management. Let's take a look at how these patterns are implemented in technology. And not surprisingly, security teams still use a broad range of threat management platforms, right, products, services, to defend their IT environments. Endpoint security is still the most common technology at 62%, with IDS, so intrusion detection, intrusion prevention systems, UTM, firewalls, following at a close second at 55%. Beyond this, we see a long tail, if you will, of platforms ranging from vulnerability management, log management, to commercial threat intelligence solutions. Let me ask Orion at Exabeam. Orion, based on the information we presented on the last couple of slides, barriers to success, threat management focus, threat management priorities, do the popular or most common threat management answers, do they surprise you, Orion?
Great question. So not really surprising, but I found it interesting. When I think of threat management, I really think of it as a process. In fact, I think Pramod mentioned it earlier on one of his answers. I really think of it as this process where you start with implementing security controls, whether that's your firewall, your IPS, endpoint security, etc. From there, you gather the data from all of that in, like an LMS or a SIM. Then you need to analyze that data, ideally holistically with something like UBA or similar, and then you need to respond to whatever sorts of incidents you've detected, ideally in an automated fashion. So what I found interesting is that the items at the beginning of this list really address the first step. So you've got your endpoint, your IDS, your IPS, and it's a lot of point solutions. Whereas the things that are further down this list, like SIM, UBA, log management, etc., help with the follow-on steps. So steps 2 and 3, and they're a little bit less popular. And in fact, if you think back a couple of slides, one of the big things that we've been seeing was, a need for incident response, and there are no IR tools anywhere on this slide. So I found that interesting. And then, to me, that might be maybe a byproduct of where people are with their security programs or where they've been focusing on their budget. So it'll be interesting to see how this evolves over time.
Yeah, interesting observation. Thanks, Orion. Now, next we asked our survey participants, what threat management capabilities, do cybersecurity professionals prioritize? And the capacity to rapidly identify and remediate attacks leads with 76%, followed by 24/7 threat intelligence, monitoring, and analytics at 72%. And that's followed by threat reporting to identify vulnerabilities at 68%. Let me ask Travis at BlueVector. Travis, why is speed of detection so important in today's threat landscape? Travis?
Yeah, so definitely incident response is embedded in here from what Ryan was mentioning. I think, time is money in today's society and world. It's even more important when it comes to cyber threat actors. So what we've seen with some of the outbreaks over the last few years around destructive malware, ransomware, etc., there's a financial incentive for disrupting systems, essentially taking information and data hostage, which causes businesses to shut down. If you look at some of the articles, some large companies that were hit with the latest outbreak of ransomware over the last couple months, shut down global operations, for a period of time. And that's massive amounts of business impact or lost revenue. The other aspects come with liability, with some of your business operations shutting down. If you're talking critical infrastructure, power plants, municipalities, things like that, if you start having destructive impact in those mindsets, in cases if you don't respond quickly and contain that damage, in some cases you can't recover from it. So essentially you can have loss of life, the financial impacts could be detrimental, and then just in general the chaos in society with some of the examples of Ukraine and some of the mass power outages there. So being able to identify the threats, mitigate and contain them quickly, prevents the destructive nature of some of the malware examples that we've seen in the news lately. So those are some important examples from the speed. If you want to get to the response and the cost side of things, the amount of time to remediate and clean up and analyze threats, weeks or months, are industry standard today. The cost to do things like that post breach are very manually intensive and cost massive amounts of money. Not to mention other losses as well. So that's definitely why speed is ever critical in this realm.
Thank you, Travis. Couldn't agree more. Now, before we open Q&A, let me ask each of you, each of our panelists, for your one piece of advice, either a best practice or recommendation that you would like to share with our audience today. And if I may suggest, let's start in the upper left and work our way alphabetically. Orion, do you want to take a stab at this? What's your advice for our audience? The one key takeaway.
Yeah. So every organization is different, and I think that security teams really need to be focused on solving the barriers that are preventing the success of their programs. Moreover, I think that they should look to implement tools that perform holistic analysis, use modern technology like machine learning, and then, in essence, do so with existing tools and data that they already have. Doing so will allow them to have a higher ROI with their existing investments. So that would be my best practice tip.
Excellent. Thanks, Orion. Pramod, your key takeaway?
Yeah. So as we saw in the slide before, and Orion mentioned about it, a lot of folks are still relying on blocking technologies, which work and they deter to a large extent. But then we've seen with insider threats, they don't completely don't have the capability to prevent. So what I would say is, rather than always looking for deterrent or blocking methods, look for the ability to detect the missing pieces. So look at the existing detection technologies out there and the evolving landscape of the user behavior analysis that a lot of companies are focusing on. and hopefully fill those missing pieces. And the ability to make sure that when something happens or when something is about to happen, you are able to see what actually happened, and the visibility towards all the steps that were taken by either a malicious user or a negligent user. So yeah, detection is probably one of the key things going forward that is going to gain some focus.
Very good. Thank you, Pramod. Mayank, what's your recommendation for our audience?
Good question, and echo some of the thoughts shared by my colleagues on the call today as well. But it comes down to very simple basics. You start with where your assets are and what assets actually have, and the answer simply comes down to data. And if you go down, build that change, what happens to the data? The users access that data. That user context is so important and critical. Understanding what your user population looks like. It could be privileged users, it could be employees, high-risk users, etc. And getting that visibility into what users do with the data is very, very important. At one of our customers, if I recall the analogy clearly, I said, data doesn't walk out on its own. It's users with malicious or non-malicious intent, which we call as insiders, are the ones responsible for stealing data at the end of the day. So if you look at this problem from a process and people and technology perspective, especially insider threat, we recommend customers to look at insider threat monitoring and prevention solutions that help you detect insider threat, streamline investigation process, and prevent data loss from happening. That's how we look at it as a best practices for customers. And from the data we have seen across the customers base, we have seen that work as a good best practice for looking at insider threats and mitigating those.
Very good. Thank you, Mayank. Salim, what best practice would you recommend?
Well, Holger, I think it's pretty clear from the research that the people are still very concerned about a lot of these threats and don't have the tools necessary to deal with the threats as they evolve. Right? It's really a cat and mouse game with some of these malicious folks who are trying to exfiltrate data, with insiders that are using their personal mobile devices to access corporate data out of cloud applications. Really putting a lot of corporate data at risk. So, the two overarching trends are cloud and mobile, right? Those are really driving a lot of the change and a lot of the new threats that organizations are facing, as well as sort of the advancement of some of these sort of go-to threat vectors, right? Whether that's malware in cloud applications or in endpoints, whether it's phishing attacks that target individual users. Really these threats are becoming more and more sophisticated, and organizations really need tools that can work to prevent, right? You need that proactive approach, and I think that's something everyone on the call would agree with, is a proactive approach to security is better than just finding out later that that you've had massive amounts of data loss, and you're going to have to now deal with the repercussions, and maybe you have some visibility into what has happened in the past, but no way to take action to get that data back, right? That's sort of the worst case, and something that no organization wants, right? So, given the proliferation of cloud and mobile data access, organizations really need to take a step back and rethink, how are you approaching data security, how are you approaching cloud security, how are you approaching mobile security, and what's the best sort of comprehensive solution that can prevent these sorts of threats.
Very good. Thank you, Salim. Next, Travis, what's your recommendation for our audience?
Sure. So I think I echo a lot of the best practices from a lot of the panelists. I think Kind of in summary, I would probably switch tunes a little bit and focus maybe on some of the non-technical best practice here. So, definitely the stakes are too high in today's world. We're becoming ever dependent on technology. I would say throughout my career, being an operator, a practitioner, and then in the vendor realm, a key pain point or observation I've seen over the years is a sense of complacency. So I would say my best practice would be, organizations or within your company, make sure you instill a culture of an aggressive mindset. So what I mean by that, constantly striving to improve the security posture of your organization. Don't use compliance as a safety net. Don't be reliant that compliance is good enough or going to keep you secure. I think, from an accountability perspective or success, some organizations treat compliance as the bare minimum. But in today's world, with the ransomware as a service, the ever-growing threats that exist today and the monetization of that, organizations have to be, way more proactive, way more aggressive in how they deal with threats. I would say, don't be afraid to adopt and try new technologies because, the adversaries are cunning and constantly adapting new techniques to get into your environment. So I would say, really adopting that aggressive mindset and don't use compliance as a crutch for why you don't do something or try something new.
Very good. Couldn't agree more. Thank you, Travis. And thank you, everybody on our panel, for your best practices. I think there were some excellent ideas in there for our audience to take away and try and implement. Let's take a look at the live audience questions that are coming in. All right, let's see. Orion, let me start with you. The question is, which statistics do you find most interesting to see how they change for next year's report? Which of these stood out for you, Orion?
Yeah, I think it's not really one stat, but maybe a couple. I'm pretty much interested to see how the security barriers and the, threat management priorities and platforms change. As I said earlier in my last answer, I feel like a lot of the target is at the beginning of the threat management lifecycle, and I'd be interested to see if it starts to shift towards, things that are more analysis and response oriented.
Very good, yeah, and we should have an answer for that early in 2018 as we do our next round of surveys on the topic and our next report and our next webinar. So yeah, good question. The next question is for Pramod. Pramod, the question is, how can security teams adapt and maintain an effective security program, when threats and technology are constantly evolving? Pramod?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think one of the panelists was mentioning that don't be afraid of trying new technologies. As the threats evolve, and a lot of panelists mentioned this cat and mouse game. So it is a cat and mouse game. So as the threats evolve, the technologies are improving, and so make sure as the landscape is progressing to try what's out there and see if it actually helps with the with specific use cases you're looking at or specific business reasons that you're looking at some of these technologies, and and make sure you revisit your security architecture and security posture on a regular basis. I think one of the panelists mentioned that a lot of people just put something in place, either compliance or something in place, and then they don't revisit. They just use that as a crutch and say, I've looked at this, right? But make sure you revisit, make sure you figure out what's your weakest link. And a lot of times that could just be, one of the policies you have where you allow people to, download, any sort of cloud application onto the device, right? And you might not even know that is happening in your environment. So the threats evolving, but then, the technologies are evolving. And revisiting the security architecture is an extremely important step that probably a lot of organizations should do more frequently.
Thank you, Pramod. The next question is for Mayank at Observit. The question is, I already have a DLP in place to reduce data leaving my organization. What would be the benefit of adding an insider threat monitoring and prevention solution to my security stack? Mayank?
Great question, Holger. And it's interesting. We did a survey with our 1,600 customers we have worldwide in different verticals, and asked a pretty straightforward question: what is the number one concern that they have? Obviously, the survey that we talked about today reflects insider threat as a growing concern. 61% said, and our survey also reflected the number one concern for CISOs has been around protecting data, and data that is attacked by external threats and insider threats. The second question we talked about was how have existing DLP solutions in place helped them, or do they see still gaps with the existing DLP solutions out there in the market? And the answer came down to be yes, and very clearly the data reflected that the visibility that the CISO needs on what the users/insiders do with the data has been a biggest challenge for the CISOs to tell a security story to their compliance team or to the board level. And this is where insider threat monitoring and prevention solutions really start to augment or replace DLP technology that customers have, primarily with an intent of doing three things. One, detecting insider threats and giving you that visibility on how your users interact with the data. Streamlining the investigation process if there is an incident that does occur and you need the evidence of what the actual user did from start to finish across not just the content such as file systems sitting on your web repositories or network shares or anywhere. So that is very important. And third, preventing that data loss from happening. So that's where insider threat monitoring and solution technology starts to play a big role with a focus on users and what do they do with the data.
Thank you, Mayank. Next, Salim, let me ask you, how has the evolution of threats impacted security spend and security tools? Salim?
Well, it's clearly, increased security spend. I think everyone has seen that. If you look at Gartner's numbers, you see a really massive growth in spend. But I think a little more interesting, and I guess part of your question, Holger, of how it has impacted security tools, is where the spend is shifting. What are people focused on spending on, right? Are they still investing in some of these legacy premises-based network security technologies? It's less common, right? People are moving a lot of their spend, now that they have some of those cost savings from adopting cloud to areas where they think it'll be more effective, right? Areas where they feel it can prevent some of these threats and really take advantage of some really the new solutions that have come out on the market to provide that comprehensive visibility and control over cloud data, so that when there is some threat that the organization faces, whether it's ransomware or malware, whether it's a phishing attack, whether it's compromised credentials, what have you, they're well equipped to deal with that. So, as an example, Big Glassware, a cloud access security broker, and CASB is a fast-growing market, and that's something as an example that where Gartner sees a lot of folks investing a lot of resources, right? That shift from securing the network perimeter to securing cloud applications, securing mobile devices, and being prepared for threats that target those new new endpoints that organizations didn't have to deal with, right? BYOD was sort of a non-issue 10 years ago, and today, most folks have access to corporate data in some way from a personal mobile device. Same with cloud. So that shift in spend and shift in focus from some of these, traditional attack vectors and traditional security solutions to these new, more effective, right, ones that take into account new methods of targeting and attacking organizations has really become the focus for a lot of folks.
Thank you, Salim. Travis, let me ask you, what are some key ways that you can, for example, folks like BlueVector can help SMBs and global enterprises detect and respond better and faster? Travis?
Sure. Great question. I would say, technologies in line with what BlueVector does essentially provide organizations capabilities to detect threats that aren't dependent on signatures. They provide the operator with rich context that makes it intuitive and easy to triage or diagnose an event to determine if it is malicious or the impact, which in turn enables them to quickly remediate or contain to prevent impact. I would say all of those capabilities, and where the human in the loop is a big challenge, or the ability to, or the need to pivot between different systems, sometimes that are siloed to get other data to put together in an investigation. So having things that are that don't prevent, from a people, process, and technology perspective, that make it as simple as possible to pivot between all three of those pillars are key ways to help organizations, small, medium, and large, detect and respond better and faster.
Excellent. Thank you, Travis. Now, as we're closing this webinar, I would like to thank everybody in our audience for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed today's webinar. Also, many thanks to our panel for sharing your unique insights and advice on threat monitoring, detection, and response. Now, this concludes today's webinar. I hope we will see all of you again at one of our future webinars. Thanks, everyone.